My name's Lisa Rayner. I'm the Livestock Project Officer for StockSense, and we've got Chelsea Hare here from Herd Solutions who's going to be presenting today. So just want to, remind everyone where we are today on our journey. So we're up to webinar 5, which is awesome. So we've just gone through 1, 2, 3, 4, and now we are at animal health, nutrition, and welfare. And then next week will be the long-term plan with Peter Reynolds. Also, I know I keep hounding on about surveys. It's sort of my job as project officer. We try and get everyone to sort of do a pre and post webinar just so when we know that we're hitting the right target market, that we're answering your questions, that we're delivering the right thing. So if you've got a few minutes or, just scan the QR code, it'll take you to a survey. It should have about 6 questions. If you could fill them in, that'd be awesome. I think we have about 40 responses. So if you haven't done it, get onto it. That'd be great. We really do look at it, and we do look at the questions which have been answered in previous webinars and probably will be answered in this one and the next one. So just an overview of what we've gone through in the previous webinar. For webinar 4, it was induction and managing stock with Malcolm. So it was preparing for your animal's arrival, getting ready, making sure that you've done your research, that your property's ready, that you've got everything, that checklist, and then doing the quarantine and paperwork when your stock finally arrive, and doing the induction and training. So low stress, relaxed, and having that first about 2 weeks for you to do that training so your animals are low stress. And of course, going through the different management calendars and key tasks. And so webinar 5, animal health, nutrition and welfare. So Chelsea will be going over these topics, the pre-purchase consideration, how to prevent your animals from getting sick in the first place. And then while they're on your property, managing their nutrition, space, the shelter, and then recognizing if they do get sick, what you should do, what to look out for, and when to call a vet and how to manage that in the future. So I will pass it on to Dr. Chelsea Hare, who is a livestock veterinarian from down in Gippsland with Herd Solutions. She'll be covering all of this sort of stuff, talking about her experiences and what's the best thing to do for your animals. So I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks, Lisa. It's really great to be here again, working with the VFF. So tonight our focus will be more on the animals and how to best take care of them and get the most out of them from a production perspective as well. But first, just a little bit about myself. So I'm a vet with 6 years of experience. So I graduated from Charles Sturt University in 2018. I graduated and went and worked in Mansfield in North Victoria for a couple of years, and then I moved back to West Gippsland and worked in Warragul for a few years. And I now reside in East Gippsland, where I work as a clinical vet, but also as a livestock consultant as well. So we go out and we help farmers with sick animals and calving cows and things like that, but we also do a lot of big picture livestock consultancy work, looking at feed base and nutrition and stocking density and things like that on farms as well. My main sort of professional interests lie in cattle medicine, and reproduction's my sort of interested area, but I love all aspects of ruminant health, which is why I'm here this evening. So when we look at purchasing some new stock, and I know this may have been covered a little bit in webinar 4, but I think the most important thing we need to think about when we look at purchasing some stock is simply how many can we stock on our property. And unfortunately, there's no sort of rule of thumb, we need 1 acre for every cow, or 5 sheep can live on an acre, etc. Calculating the carrying capacity of your property takes a lot of work, and there's a lot of inputs that come at arriving at a decision that's appropriate and reasonable for what a property can carry on farm. So the things that we look at when considering the carrying capacity of the property are your location, your rainfall pattern, your soil type, and what sort of pasture base you can grow on that property. Obviously, if you've got a property that's full of weeds like love grass or Parramatta grass, that's going to substantially reduce the nutrient production that you can create on farm for the grazing stock. So that's another thing that we'd look into as well. And then once you have a bit of an idea of what sort of feed you can grow, then you need to look at what's going to happen on your farm throughout the calendar year and try best to manage, high input periods such as calving or weaning, where animals are going to need lots of energy, and manage that so that those periods of time are occurring when you know that feed availability is likely to be high. So in most southern production systems, that's going to be typically spring and to a lesser extent autumn. And so if we can get a pasture growth curve and look at what you're going to do with your property, that's going to give you the best idea of when to calve, when to wean, etc. This, as I said, is not a simple topic. So the best person you could speak to is an agronomist, and most of your livestock agents, if you work with someone like Elders or Nutrien, they'll often have an agronomist on hand that can help you to consider a carrying capacity that is appropriate for your property. And I just thought I'd pop these pictures in here. So these come from the Evergraze website, and there's one for each sort of individual region within Victoria and also across Australia. And I certainly don't want people to look at these and go, oh, well, I need to be growing Phalaris or Cocksfoot or anything like that. But they do give a really good idea of what a reliable pasture growth looks like for each individual region. So for example, on the left here, we've got the southwest in Hamilton, which obviously has got a much higher winter feed compared to somewhere like northeast Victoria in Seymour. So when we want to purchase stock and have them on our property, these are the sorts of things we need to look at when looking at how many we can actually have. The other things that we need to look at are if we're going to really push the stocking density in terms of what we can actually grow on farm, we may need to be prepared to supplementary feed if there's going to be a drought or your typical seasonal feed gaps. And seasonal supplementary feeding can be very costly, and it does require infrastructure. So it requires tractors and it requires feeders, and it also requires a safe terrain in which to do so. So if we're going to really push the boundaries of what we can put on our property, we do need to be prepared to do these things. The other things we need to look at are, do we have appropriate holding facilities for the animals that we're purchasing? So the absolute bare minimum is being a yard, race and functional crush. The facilities need to be safe for the personnel and for the stock. So as a vet, I've been the pretty unfortunate witness of animals that have actually died in routine yarding situations because, sometimes yards are just somewhat unsafe for stock, and I've seen stock break legs. I've seen stock get heads stuck in places and they've choked to death. So it's not only for the people that are moving your stock, but it's also for the stock themselves as well. And I've just popped that point down the bottom there that most vets don't hold dart gun licenses. And if I unfortunately had $1 for every time I was asked to dart something, I could probably buy one, but we don't actually routinely carry them. It's a pretty tricky license to get a dart gun license. So 99% of vets don't have them. So having proper holding facilities is really important especially we're having things like cattle where, the size of them does make it impossible to hold them ourselves. And obviously, when we purchase new animals, we need to quarantine them properly. So when we quarantine new animals, 21 days is the absolute minimum time that we need to be quarantining the new stock from any existing stock you might already have. There's a very important reason why we use 21 days. Firstly, weed seeds will remain in the rumen for a minimum of 10 days. So we want to keep them in a yard where we can have all those weeds defecated out of the cow before we go and put those animals out on your pasture. The other thing is that if we're purchasing animals from somewhere like a sale yard environment has got lots of different animals from lots of different locations. And so it's actually quite common for animals to pick up diseases at a sale yard. So a lot of the incubation periods that we deal with in animals can last for beyond 14 days, which is why the 21-day rule applies for these stock. The other important thing is that we need to separate these stock with no nose-to-nose contact. So simply having them over the fence is not enough, because nose-to-nose contact, as we're probably aware from having COVID and lockdowns for the last few years, nose-to-nose contact can actually spread quite a lot of diseases. And the other thing is, if we're buying new stock, look at getting vaccination and drenching records upon purchase. So your National Cattle Health Statement should have all of this information, or alternatively just call the selling producer if that's available to you. if we've got animals coming in, we want to be giving them at an absolute minimum a quarantine drench, and we want that quarantine drench to be a multi-active oral drench. And I'll talk about drenching a little bit more in a few slides time, but we want a multi-active so that if there's any resistance to any of the worms that are coming in with those stock, that we're not going to have those stock going out and contaminating your existing pasture with resistant worms. So a multi-active drench example could be Q-drench for sheep or trifecta for cattle. Not that we're affiliated with those companies, it's just two examples of some multi-active drenches that we have available to us. The other things to consider, if we've got animals coming from a high fluke risk region, you might want to consider doing an oral fluke drench as well, and also inspecting the sheep for lice and considering lice treatment if you're buying sheep as well. Vaccinations, if you can be absolutely certain that an animal has had a vaccine prior to coming to your property within 2 to 3 weeks, this may be enough. But if you can't verify that they've been vaccinated recently, for the low cost of doing a 5-in-1 or a 7-in-1, I'd highly recommend that you booster them on arrival as well. This is for all classes of stock. So as I said, if there's any doubt, if you save one animal from a clostridial disease, then it makes the vaccine a very cost-effective decision to do. The last thing, just always use the same paddock or pen for your quarantine as well. So we don't want to be spreading weed seeds and things like that from paddock to paddock by using a different quarantine at each time. So if we can use the same set of yards, it's just going to keep the weed management on your property a lot more straightforward. And obviously in that 21 days that we're quarantining the new stock, we want to be monitoring them closely for signs of disease. And I'll go through again later what we need to look out for in these stock. Just going into vaccinations a little bit. So in general, all animals that you have on your property need to be vaccinated for clostridial diseases. So in cattle, that's the 5-in-1 or the 7-in-1. And for sheep, there's Tasvax, and there's also a 5-in-1 for sheep as well. And there's also a 6-in-1. The reason we need to vaccinate all stock against these vaccines is because clostridial diseases live in the soil. So unfortunately, even with the best biosecurity in the world, there's always going to be clostridial diseases, much like we as people need to be constantly vaccinated for tetanus because it lives in the environment. So with cattle, if you've just got if you've just got steers, 5-in-1 is perfectly fine. The 7-in-1 component has got clostridial diseases, and it's also got 2 strains of leptospirosis. And the reason we might want to cover cattle for leptospirosis, obviously, is because it's important to cover the cattle against lepto. But the main reason we actually recommend it is because it's an occupational health and safety hazard for your workers to be getting leptospirosis. So one of the major reasons we want to actually vaccinate the cattle against 7-in-1 is so that your staff can't catch leptospirosis from them. And that becomes particularly important if you've got staff members or you yourself are going to be assisting with any calvings or, anything where you're going to come into close contact with bodily fluids from those cows, because that's where people can catch leptospirosis from cattle. These are certainly not an exhaustive list of all the vaccinations available to cattle, but there is a couple of vaccines on the market, such as Vibrio and Pestivirus. And we've also got some respiratory vaccines for IBHA and Mannheimia hemolytica. There's also a handful of scours vaccines available. So we've got rotavirus, corona, and salmonella. And these are certainly not required in every instance. So the best thing you can do there is just have a chat to your vet about what you think would be appropriate for your farm. If you're breeding cows and calves, sometimes it's a good idea to vaccinate against reproductive diseases so that there's no reproductive wastage on farm. And certainly, if you're having big problems with scours, it might be worthwhile doing a scour virus vaccination process. But as I said, for all farms, this is very much a not one size fits all sort of scenario. So have a chat to your local vet about what diseases you might come into contact with and what might be the best way forward for your farm. And again, for sheep, we've got a Campylobacter vaccine, and we've also got erysipelas as well. There's also a handful of other vaccines available for sheep on the market. But as I said before, the most important thing is that we cover everything for the clostridial diseases, and those vaccines are available from most of your stock health agencies and vet clinics. So moving on to drenching. So we cover drenching to eliminate any parasites on our livestock, and that can include our internal parasites such as worms and liver fluke, but also our external parasites such as flies and lice. And again, for drenching, the requirements between properties can vary quite considerably. So we've got our oral and injectable drenches, and we also have pour-ons. And what we recommend is if we can avoid pour-ons, that is preferable. I know pour-ons are a lot easier to administer to stock, but unfortunately, when we see pour-ons, what tends to happen is animals can lick them off one another. And also we know that the absorption across the skin of a pour-on drench can be very variable between stock. So what ends up happening is if we give all those stock a pour-on, some of them might get a therapeutic amount of drench, but some of them might not. So we don't get an even drench across the mob of animals, which is where our oral and injectable drenches are preferred. Our young stock are most at risk when it comes to particularly internal parasites. So we want to be protecting those and having a really robust drench parasite prevention program for those young stock especially. And what we're seeing more and more is that drench resistance is becoming a real problem. So what I would certainly recommend, particularly for sheep and goats, is that you consider doing some worm egg counts before drenching, because sometimes a drench is not always indicated. And also for livestock, just in general, trying to minimize the number of drenches we do and doing them at the appropriate times of year so that we're not over drenching is going to be really important going into the future, because it takes a lot of money and time from drug companies to create a new drench, and they don't always come on the market very often. So often we're sort of stuck with the same active ingredients for a very long period of time before something new comes about. Another thing that's important to remember is that we can also control worms with non-chemical control. So what I mean by that is having a pasture rotation system in place so that paddocks get rested and the larvae that contaminate the pasture naturally die away. So having 4 to 8 paddocks, particularly for sheep, and rotating those sheep across those paddocks can be a really important form of non-chemical control. The other thing you can do is, if you are able to stock cattle and sheep, is to rotate cattle and sheep across pastures as well, so that there's no build-up of one particular species of worm. And another thing to just remember is worm larvae can retain on pasture for 1 to 6 months, depending on the weather conditions. So again, this is where worm egg counts come really handy for making sure that we're not over drenching, because we don't want those resistant larvae to build up in the environment. So for sheep in particular, it's recommended to just do a worm egg count every couple of months before drenching, because as I said, sometimes it's not always essential. For this evening's purpose, I'm trying not to be too descriptive on when exactly people should drench and what you should be using, because as I said before, it can vary so much from property to property. But what I would recommend, if you want more information on what sort of drench program you should have based on your location, is to head to the link that we've popped in the slides here. There's a really great web source called WormBoss, and so it's got heaps of drench decision guides and drench programs based on your location. So I've popped this one in here. This is one for our location where I am in Gippsland, so it's based on our rainfall data and our pasture growth data, and there's ones for different environments, different species of animals, and different autumn and spring calving herds as well. So if you want more information, WormBoss is one of the best resources going, and that's where we source a lot of our information as vets as well. Moving on to nutrition. So just a bit of a basic rundown on the, internal physiology of ruminants. Cattle, sheep, and goats, they all have a large four-stomach chamber called the rumen, which is filled with bacteria, fungi, and protozoa, which ferment our feed. And then what ruminants do is they regurgitate fibrous feed for additional chewing time, and that additional chewing time helps to break down the fiber so that ruminants can actually use it as an energy source. And that's what makes ruminants really unique compared to other animal species. So ruminants are adapted to a low energy, high fiber diet, and they can actually use fiber as an energy source, unlike cats, dogs, and humans. The bacteria that are responsible for the digestion, so the bacteria, fungi, and the protozoa, they take 10 days to adapt to a new feed. So whenever we look at changing the diet of a ruminant, we want to do it over 10 days because those internal bugs, they need some time to adapt. So we see a lot of animals, they can get quite sick if we have major feed changes in a very small space of time. One of the most important nutrients when considering animal nutrition is in fact water. So it's really important that we obviously have stock having access to water at all times of the day. And something I've seen, unfortunately, a fair bit as a vet is troughs and water systems that fail. And I've unfortunately seen stock die because there's been, major problems with watering systems not getting water to stock when they should. And just remember that a lactating cow can drink up to 140 litres of water a day. So if you've got a large number of stock on a hot day and the water trough system fails, they can run out of water very, very quickly. So obviously that means checking troughs on high risk periods is an extremely important exercise to be doing. But also just when we're thinking about how much water we need to have available to these stock at any given time as well. So the three main nutrients that we look at when making a diet or a nutrition plan for stock are obviously energy, but also protein and fiber. So the nutrient requirements of stock will vary quite substantially depending on what species we're feeding, the age and growth requirements. So obviously young stock that are freshly weaned and are growing into adults, they're going to have pretty high energy requirements. And lactation can put a really huge metabolic demand on a cow or a sheep. So lactation can account for a lot of metabolizable energy requirements by these animals and also gestation status as well. Obviously, if animals are exposed to really cold temperatures, they're going to have higher energy requirements than if they're in a thermoneutral zone. And also if animals are exercising, so if you're moving them frequently or they have to cover large amounts of ground to get to water, then their exercise requirements are going to contribute to their overall nutrient requirement. And I've just popped this table in here, and I by no means expect people to go home and study it or memorize it, but just to get a bit of an idea of what sort of metabolizable energy requirements can vary between different classes of stock. And I've just used cattle here as an example. So much like when we look at the food that we consume and we look at it in kilojoules or calories, in cattle, we use the term ME, which is metabolizable energy. And it's measured in megajoules of energy per kilo of dry matter of feed. So we can see just in the table a cow that's on a maintenance energy requirement, so a cow that's not pregnant and is just going about her day as usual, requires an average of about 8 megajoules of energy in her diet across what she eats throughout the day. We compare that to a cow that is lactating, and that energy requirement goes up to 10.5. So that's a pretty substantial increase in energy requirements, and that's just because that cow is lactating. The other thing to just remember as well is that the class of stock that have the highest crude protein requirements is those calves from sort of 4 to 8 months of age that are in their really rapid growth stage. So when we've got calves in that age bracket, we really need to make sure we're getting adequate protein up to them so that they keep growing, because there's more and more data coming out that calves that don't get adequate nutrition between 4 and 8 months of age can have really long-term performance limitations later on in the track as well, just in terms of, you know, reproductive efficiency and how much they grow throughout their life. So getting that key nutrition sorted and up to date early is really important. So we're setting those calves up for a lifetime of good health and good productivity. So if we're going to be obviously feeding our livestock, the most common thing we're going to be feeding them is pasture, but obviously we're going to be getting occasionally silage, hay, or grain and pellets when pasture is running a little bit low. There are a lot of nutrient tables out there that can estimate the nutrient value of these feeds. However, the actual values can vary quite significantly, and I'll show you guys some tables in a minute that really can show just how much they can vary. So if we're buying feed for, you know, those really high energy periods, such as, you know, cows that are lactating or weaners that are in a rapid growth stage, it's a really good idea to get a feed test with any feed that you buy into the property, so you know exactly what you're paying for and what class of stock is appropriate to be feeding those purchased feeds to. So these come from the Dairy Australia website. And again, I don't want anyone to go and study these tables or learn anything, but just have a look at how much these values can really, really vary. So if we take lucerne hay, for example, you know, the median is 10.1 megajoules of metabolizable energy, but it ranges from 6.2 to 12.1. So nearly double in range. So we can really have quite a fluctuation. And if you're trying to use these feeds to, you know, do a really important nutrition plan for some high risk stock that really need it, it's good to have this information available so that we know exactly what our stock are getting. And same again for crude protein. So another example I found quite fascinating here is if we look at cereal hay and, you know, the mean crude protein being 9.2% dry matter in crude protein, but it varies from 1.8 to 22. So that's a huge variation. So again, just getting a feed test whenever we're purchasing purchasing feeds for these high risk stock is really, really valuable. Another thing I thought we'd just touch on is the concept of a dry sheep equivalent. So these tables, again, I certainly don't want anybody to go home and memorize, but it just gives us a really good idea of, you know, how much energy our animals require when we're trying to compare them to one another. So when we call something a dry sheep equivalent, we're referring to a 50 kilogram wether, which is a castrated sheep, that is maintaining a constant weight. So what we've got here in this table is showing that if we look down at 50 kilo ewes down the bottom with a twin lamb at foot, they have a dry sheep equivalent of 3.2. So their energy requirements are 3.2 times heavier than a 50 kilo wether. And then when we go across and we look at cattle, the numbers go up even further. So if we're looking at, for example, a 200 kilo weaned calf growing 250 grams a day, that's the equivalent of a 5.5 dry sheep equivalents. So we're going up quite substantially in the nutrient requirements of that single unit of stock. Or if we compare it even further again, we've got, you know, a 500 kilo cow down the bottom right with a 7 to 10 month old calf at foot, and it's an equivalent of 25 dry sheep equivalents. So we've looked at a really, you know, pretty substantial jump in energy requirements just simply by changing the livestock species and what they're doing throughout their day. Just a little note on trace elements as well, because they do make up a really important part of our animal nutrition. Many regions of Victoria are deficient in trace elements, and this can vary quite substantially according to where you live. In Victoria, the three most common ones that we see are selenium, copper, and cobalt, which is translated into B12 within the rumen. Important thing to remember with trace elements is that trace elements are required in trace amounts, and that can mean that toxicity can occur very, very easily, particularly if we are looking at something like sheep, because they are very, very sensitive to copper toxicity. So if you think you might have a trace element deficiency, get in contact with your local vet and arrange to have some blood tests done on your stock or some plant tissue tests done on your pasture, so you know exactly what's going on. Again, as a vet, I've been the unfortunate witness of inappropriate trace element supplementation, and it can result in death if we don't get it right, because these can accumulate very, very quickly when they aren't required. So as I said before, just have a chat to your vet about what you think might be necessary, and always read your labels and give things appropriately. Another note just on nutrition before we move on to the next topic. I just thought I'd touch on restricted animal material, which is defined as any material taken from the vertebrate other than tallow, gelatin, milk products, or oils. And it includes rendered products such as blood meal, meat and bone meal, fish meal, poultry, eggs, feather, and compounded feeds. The reason I pop this in here is because I've seen, particularly on social media, a lot of people recommending feeding eggs to young stock that may not have got colostrum at birth, because eggs are quite high in protein and quite high in energy. But it's actually illegal to feed these products to ruminants in Australia. So that does unfortunately include eggs. So when we've got animals that have not had appropriate levels of colostrum, it's best to have a chat to your vet about what you could potentially do to troubleshoot that, because unfortunately eggs can't be given to any class of livestock in Australia. And just moving on to body condition scoring. So I've actually moved to sheep, because sheep are a great example of how body condition scoring can really help your farm to sort of perform a little bit better. And it's really, really useful as a tool to assess the nutritional status of your herd. So how we do body condition scoring is by feeling along the short ribs of the backbone and the tail head, as the picture there suggests. And we place these sheep on a scale of 1 to 5. And there's also systems available for doing it for cattle as well. But for this purpose, we'll just be chatting about sheep for now. Particularly, I thought it was good to use sheep as an example, because often when they're covered in wool, we can't really see at a glance, like we can with cattle, what sort of condition our sheep are in. So we really just need to yard them and do some body condition score. And it's not really a substitute for just looking at them in the paddock. And the same goes also for alpacas, because alpacas, again, when they've got lots of fleece, can be really difficult to see what's going on beneath it. So you do need to get them in and just have a feel of those short ribs and just see exactly how much condition they have sitting there. And we've got some charts on the right-hand side there, which will be available. So it shows you exactly what class of body condition they are based on how easily palpable the tail head and the short ribs are. And then we've got some targets depending on what stage of production our sheep are in. So if we've got ewes prior to joining, we want them in a condition score 3 out of 5. If we have lower condition scores than this, it can substantially reduce the conception rate. So we know from a lot of studies that have been done in both sheep and cattle that low body condition score can seriously reduce the frequency of ovulation in these animals. So obviously they're not going to get pregnant if they're not ovulating. So that's why we need them in a good condition score for joining. And then in late pregnancy and going into lactation, we want them in a minimum of 2.7 out of 5 for singles and 3.3 for twin bearing ewes, because those twin bearing ewes are going to lose a lot more of their body reserves as they go through lactation, having to support 2 mouths rather than 1. And this is going to be really important for supplementing the growth of that next generation of lambs and the survivability of those lambs. The other thing is, though, we also don't want them too fat going into late pregnancy and lactation, because that can obviously lead to pregnancy-related dystocia, so having trouble lambing as well. For dry ewes, we want them in a condition score 3 out of 5, optimal wool production and survival. And rams, we want at the start of joining to be at a condition score 3. And obviously rams are going to be working quite hard throughout the joining period. So it's quite normal for them to fall down to a 2 by the end of joining, but we don't want them to get below a 2. So when we're doing body condition scoring, the 2 key times we really want to be getting our sheep in to body condition score is a couple of months before the start of joining and a couple of months before they start lambing. So if there's any issues with the body condition score, we've got a couple of months up our sleeve to get the sheep where they want to be so that there's not going to be any major dramas during these high risk periods. And just a little note on shelter as well, because sheep especially can be quite prone to heat stress, but any period of extreme heat can cause heat stress to all classes of animals, so sheep and cattle and goats. So maybe just consider a shade cloth or some shelter belts if you've got them available. So that can be something as simple as a tree line or a hedge, just to prevent heat stress especially, and also if we've got high periods of wind as well. Heat stress definitely can kill. Again, as a vet, I've seen it with my own eyes, and it can be really, really distressing for anyone that's got a farm. So ensuring that your most vulnerable stock, which are young stock and pregnant ewes, have most access to the shelter is going to be most important during hot days. And ensure that you have enough shade so that animals don't smother each other in attempting to seek shade as well. We can also see issues with lameness and mastitis if we don't give them enough stocking density under shaded areas, because what happens is animals tend to urinate and defecate in the same area, which can lead to a buildup of pathogens which get into their feet and can also get into the mammary glands and cause mastitis as well. And just a quick note again on rearing healthy calves. If there's anyone here that's purchasing calves from dairy farms, it's certainly in my district, it's very, very common. Calf shed design and stocking density within those sheds is really, really important. And again, I like to use COVID as an example because it's so fresh in everyone's mind. But, you know, the lower the stocking density within a shed, the less likely we are going to be to have, you know, transmission of any sort of disease, but especially respiratory disease. So we want these calves to have a minimum of 1.5 to 2 meters square of floor space if we're rearing them indoors. And if we're getting large numbers of calves, it's really important that we establish core groups and don't mix them up once they've been established, because at the end of the day, calves are always going to bring in some diseases, but what we don't want is lots of diseases being mixed between lots of, different groups of animals. And it's really important to get a sick pen for calves as well, because often calves from dairy farms may get scours, and it's important that we isolate them really, really quickly. And also just have a think about what sort of bedding we're going to have for these calves, because we want them to be kept nice and warm, especially when we're purchasing them in June, July, August, when it's going to be quite cold. Having appropriate bedding can be really, really essential for creating a nice little microclimate at the floor level so these calves don't get too cold. And that's going to prevent them from losing weight, and it's going to free up more metabolizable energy, which can be put onto the calves' back as body condition. And again, coming back to COVID, having good air circulation without causing drafts, just like we found when we were trying to do our social distancing. Ventilation is really important as well. So all these things can help prevent respiratory disease in these calves as well. So moving on to early signs of disease in livestock, it's really important that we check these ruminants really, really frequently, because as ruminants have sort of evolved, they will tend to really mask signs of disease until it's really too late. So by the time we see something that's really sick, often it can mean that they're potentially at a terminal point of the disease, because they will hide it really, really well in the early stages. So looking for early signs of disease is really, really important so that we pick these problems up early. So any signs of disease that we want to be called out for include a reduced feed intake, any scours or dags or straining to defecate, and also straining to urinate as well. Droopy ears is a really important sign, and that can be a sign of pneumonia. And sunken eyes can be an indicator of early signs of dehydration. And looking at the gum colour, also in cows, if you can check the vulval mucous membrane colour, because it's just a little bit easier than checking the mouth. If they're pale, we need to see those animals as well. And drooling at the mouth is a very non-specific sign, but often indicates that there's something wrong. And often we'll see the first sign will be that an animal will just be tailing behind the rest of the mob. And sometimes that's all you'll see before they get really sick. So if you've got something standing off in the corner by itself, it's worth getting it in and just taking a bit of a closer look at it. And then we've got lameness, any loss of body condition, and teeth grinding is a really important one as well. Teeth grinding in ruminants often indicates that there's something painful going on. So some of the really common diseases we see in cattle, one of the most common ones I see as a vet is obstetrical issues, so calvings and prolapses, which is what that bottom picture is there. So that's a uterine prolapse immediately after calving. Respiratory disease, which is pneumonia, is also very common. We've got calf scours and pink eye, any signs of lameness. Certainly where I come from, tyleria is a major problem, which is a cause of jaundice in cattle caused by a blood parasite, sort of similar to malaria in people. We also see a lot of pestivirus, and then our metabolic diseases such as milk fever and grass tetany. And the common diseases we see with sheep, unfortunately, sudden death with sheep is very, very common. So just like to say early, if you've got sheep that are dying, the best thing you can do is call a vet within a couple of hours of the sheep dying, because a post-mortem is the best tool we have available to us to get a diagnosis. Often, again, as I said, with sheep, like cattle, they will not show any major signs of disease, but they can often just have sudden death as the only sign that you get. So getting an early post-mortem can be the really big difference between stopping an outbreak of something in its tracks or having large numbers of death. Sheep are really sensitive to Barber's pole worm, which causes anemia. Another common problem we see is what we call SME, which is starvation, mismothering, and exposure. Obviously, most of us have probably heard of fly strike. Sheep can also have obstetrical issues such as lambing and prolapses, and also foot rot and plant toxicities during drought periods are another really common one we see with sheep. And then just moving on to goats, because I know that goats are becoming increasingly popular as well. I just thought I'd mention that goats are browsers and not grazers, which means that they're really, really predisposed to getting worms, and they don't have the natural resistance to worms that we have in other species. So we also have a lot of resistance to wormers in goats as well. And unfortunately, we don't have many on-label drenches available to us to treat for goats. So that's unfortunately where you need to get your vet involved if you want to put a drench program in place, because to put off-label medications such as drenches into your goat parasite prevention program, you do need a veterinary prescription because it does require off-label treatment. Another common thing we see with goats, because they tend to gorge themselves on things they shouldn't, is plant toxicities, but also acidosis, which is where these animals can get into feed sheds and eat large amounts of grain and get grain poisoning. And there's also a viral condition called caprine arthritis encephalitis, which is thankfully becoming less and less common, but we do still see it commonly, and it's more common in the dairy breeds than the meat breeds, but it's something that we often go out and have to troubleshoot as well. Okay, and just a little bit on emergency management. So we should always have a vet contacted immediately if we have any stock that are down and can't rise to their feet. If there's any calvings or lambings taking place and they're not progressing within a reasonable period of time. So often with cattle, we say up to 1 to 2 hours of active pushing, and if there's no major progress, then we need to intervene, and similar goes for sheep. Anything that involves non-weight-bearing lameness requires a veterinary intervention, as well as any neurological signs and respiratory distress. So what I mean by that is panting or obvious laboured breathing. And it's worth just having a bit of a plan on your property for emergency euthanasia, just because sometimes your vet might not be able to get there as quick as you would like. And if we've got something suffering, it's just worth having a plan in place so that you can euthanize something in a timely manner. So there's lots of different options available. So we've got firearms, which obviously come with a lot of pros and cons in terms of licensing and storage requirements. Captive bolts are a really good way to sort of get around the licensing requirements for a firearm, because you can purchase them. You can purchase them online, and you can purchase them in a lot of stock feed stores. And there's a lot of courses out there on how to use a captive bolt as well. And they are very humane when done appropriately. And I've just popped a link down the bottom, which goes through the landmarks of where to euthanize something appropriately. And once we've euthanized something, the most important thing we always need to remember to do is check that it is definitely dead. So we have what we call the 5-finger head check, which the link at the bottom goes through. So the most important thing is we don't want them to be breathing. There needs to be no tongue tone, no jaw tone, a fixed and dilated stare, and no blink reflex. And so we call that the 5-finger head check. And as I said, the link goes through it so that if you want to go have a look at that, you can. And obviously, we also have an overdose of anesthesia, which is a veterinary only procedure. But as I said, I think it's also just worth having some sort of plan in place, whether that be you or someone that you know and trust that can euthanize animals for you, just because vets can't always be there as quickly as we would like. And I know that because I say that as I am a vet. Sometimes if they're stuck at other emergencies and things like that, and we know something needs to be euthanized, unfortunately, it's not nice to talk about, but sometimes we do just need to have a plan in place so that animals don't suffer unnecessarily. And the last thing I'd like to touch on just before we go to question time. So it's important that we keep records of all veterinary treatments. And this is actually an LPA requirement, and you can very much be audited on these requirements as well. So recording all animal health treatments is really important. So that's all vaccines, drenches, medications, etc. And ensure that all the withholding periods and export sorting intervals are obeyed as well. There are significant penalties that apply for these infringements, and there are a lot of through the integrity systems, there are a lot of checks that occur to make sure that people are doing the right thing. Ensure that all your treatments are given as per the drug label, and record what stock are treated, the number of stock, the product, batch number, expiry date, and dose rate, as well as the operator that's giving the treatment. If you go to the LPA website, they've got lots of great templates available so that you don't have to go out and make any yourself. There's some really great ones available online that are free to be downloaded and used. So that's it from me, Lisa. I think that moves us into question time.
Awesome. If anyone would like to, you can raise your hand on the bottom right corner, or you can type in the chat if you have any questions. Might be health related, so I can allow on my screen to actually allow you to speak. Video won't show up, but I'll ask your question live to Chelsea, if that's what you would like. There's a question that's come through our surveys. They said how to identify serious issues from non-serious issues, how to figure out whether your animal is not doing okay and they'll be okay in a few days, or whether, maybe it is time to call a vet. Is it something that if you see something, maybe monitor it for a day or 2 or 3?
I think it probably, as you said, Lisa, it depends very much on the severity of what the animal's doing. So, if we've got something that just seems a bit off color, but they're still eating and drinking, it might be reasonable just to see if they feel better the next day. The main things we look at are, is if it's an emergency, is there any major problems with demeanor? So are they flat and barely responsive to a person when you go out in the paddock? Anything that involves respiratory difficulty needs a same day appointment and shouldn't be left overnight. If there's any trouble breathing, sometimes a low grade lameness may resolve with time on its own, but it's where I put into it non-weight bearing lame. If something is non-weight bearing lame, then we need to be seeing it sooner rather than later. And what was the other thing I was going to say? And anything like a calving difficulty or a prolapse or something like that obviously needs a same day intervention.
Yep. Just got one here. Can you allow stock to drink bore water, which is a little high in salinity? What's the water quality level that stock should be drinking?
Oh, look, I certainly couldn't rattle off the salinity levels
Yep.
off the top of my head, but there is definitely cut-off levels available, and there is lots of people that you can get your water tested through as well. So we
Yep.
use a lab called RLS in Vanilla,
Okay.
and so we often send off water samples, and they'll have critical cut-off levels. And yeah, if you're using bore water, it's definitely worth getting it tested because bore water can just vary so much.
Yep. Beautiful. I think Malcolm, you have a question if you want to unmute yourself.
Chelsea, just wondering about pink eye. Could you describe all the symptoms and what to look for and how to treat?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing heaps of pink eye at the moment. It's I think every second job I go to, I'm talking about pink eye at the moment. There's actually been a bit of research done of late, and so basically, what pink eye is an umbrella term for what we suspect is a lot of different conditions that are occurring within the eye of a cow. So often it involves some degree of infection and some degree of ulceration on the surface of the eye. And so often treatment involves some sort of combination of a topical cream or an injection of a long-acting antibiotic, or a pain relief injection, or a patch, or a combination of those, depending on the severity. And the attitudes towards pink eye are sort of evolving every day, and there's been a lot of work done recently that would sort of suggest that what we previously understood with pink eye may not be as much of the case as what we thought. But basically, we've got lots of risk factors that tend to precipitate an outbreak, and those risk factors that we know are stress, production related processes such as weaning, and we've actually been seeing, we often suspect there's a bit of an underlying disease process going on as well. So whether that be something like pestivirus infection going through the herd or IBR or something like that. So it's a very multifactorial disease, but the mainstays of treatment still remain antibiotic creams, pain relief, patches, and long-acting antibiotics.
What about grass seeds?
And yeah, I was about to say, what we often suspect is the case is that there's often a primary trauma that occurs to the surface of the eye. So tall standing filarius that's gone to head is a really common one, and cocksfoot and things like that. And so what we think is happening is these stock are being poked in the eye, and then we're seeing a secondary infection as a result of that. And so what we need to do is treat that secondary infection.
I had a question. I've had a lot of, I guess, people ask that when they do have an emergency that their vet is probably too far away, especially if you live regionally, they might be busy with another situation, or they might be too far out. They don't really have access to it. I think especially if a livestock veterinarian, when we, when you're closer to Melbourne, a lot of the livestock vets are probably out your way or out east or north. I guess, what do you do in that situation? Is it all right to just call your vet and sort of get sort of a bit of advice over the phone? Like those
Yeah,
sorts of situations.
it's a great question, and unfortunately, yeah, I wish I had lots of answers on why we don't have enough regional vets in regional areas. It's a really, really tricky problem that we've got at the moment. I think for anything, what I'll first say is anything that's sort of stuck on its side and cast itself, the most important thing you can do from an emergency perspective is try and roll that animal onto its chest, because once they've got themselves on their side, they're going to start trapping gas in the rumen, which is going to make them bloated and make them really uncomfortable. So anything that's cast on its side, just rolling it onto its chest, and if you can, placing something like a round bale or a large hay square next to them to sort of prop them up so they're sitting on their chest and keeping them comfortable until a vet can arrive is really important. Certainly, in the meantime, administering, providing things like food and water until a person can get there is really important. And yeah, beyond that, unfortunately, sometimes it means you just need to call other clinics until you can get someone. And yeah, if you've got any calving difficulties and things like that, I know a lot of producers are starting to have a go at them themselves, and there's courses and things available that can help producers to learn how to do everything properly so that we're not making it potentially worse for the vet that comes out. And I'm certainly not averse to people upskilling themselves so that because we can't always be there. It's just a reality at the moment. So I think any sort of education that enables producers to upskill themselves so that they can at least provide some first aid until we get there is going to be really useful.
Appreciate it. Don't think we have any other questions, and I know you already answered the question that came through before. Hold on, I hold my thought, but you already answered the question that came through on the surveys about, I guess, how to put a badly injured animal down. So we've already covered that, which is brilliant. Malcolm, you have another question?
Yes, just as regards drenching, how do you estimate how much to give the animal?
Yeah, good question. Obviously, if we've got scales, that'd be the best way. There are some weight tapes available. One thing that I've certainly done over time, and it's something that I've learned over many, many years, is actually attending other animals being weighed. So it just gets your eye in terms of estimating the body weight pretty consistently. If you're doing really small stock like lambs, what you can do is actually take your scales from your bathroom. And what I've done in the past for really, really small stock is actually pick them up and just physically weigh them with me holding them and not holding them, so that particularly for those really small stock that are susceptible to toxicity, you're not over drenching them. And then, unfortunately for larger stock, you do sometimes just have to make an estimate. There are weight tapes available. They're not always super, super accurate. So sometimes you need to combine, a weight tape, the body condition, because that can distort things a little bit as well if they're in super high body condition. And just experience of estimating weight is unfortunately the only time we have available. But if you can get out there and actually watch cattle being weighed and get your eye in, I think that's a really good tool to be able to know that you're estimating appropriately.
Better to over drench than under drench?
For certain classes of ingredients, yes. All I will say though, particularly if you've got some drenches out there and you're really towing the line with things like ivermectin, just be really careful, because we can see toxicities where there's very clear guidelines on certain drenches that certain stock below a certain age or weight class shouldn't be administered those drenches, because ivermectin below a certain weight threshold will cause neurological deficits. So just being really careful that, I agree that over a certain weight class, certainly you want to be giving them a little bit more rather than a little bit less. But uniquely when it comes to young stock and using things like trifecta and things like that, you really want to make sure that they are over that threshold so that you're not causing any toxicity.
I have another question. I've heard a lot of people get either very young lambs or young calves. I guess, is there a higher risk when getting young lambs or young animals that the amount of care and the risk of them suddenly dying or getting sick, is there a cutoff age that's sort of recommended if you are going to buy younger stock?
I think sort of right up to that weaning period, obviously the younger they are, the higher risk they are of sudden neonatal death. But I know from experience that unfortunately you can experience it really right up until they're 12 months of age. And you can't really let your guard down until they're an adult, because we see different classes of disease in different stages of young stock, if that makes sense. But obviously the younger they are, the more likely they are to succumb to disease, just because they don't have the same immune system functionality.
Yep. Okay. 12 months. Wow. I wouldn't have picked it like that, but yeah. Wow. Peter, you've got a question. I think you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. Great presentation. Something you hadn't touched on is people bringing either rams or bulls onto their property to join their ewes or their cows, and there's some risks involved in that. So maybe you might just want to touch on that briefly.
Yeah, sure. I actually covered that in a lot of detail in the VFF one I did last year. So the two things we really worry about, and we're seeing it more and more, is vibriosis is the first one, and also pestivirus as well. So certainly with bulls, we want to make sure that we've got a bull coming onto the property that's been vaccinated for Vibrio, and that means having 2 shots 4 weeks apart prior to coming onto the property, because Vibrio is really tricky to control once you've got it and can cause pretty disastrous pre-test results, and I've been unfortunate vet that's had to go out and see, 50% of cows empty. So yeah, it's becoming more and more common, and we suspect it's becoming more common because there's been cattle moving south with the break of the most recent drought we've had. So yeah, we've very much flown under the radar with Vibrio and been quite lucky up until recently that we haven't had it, but it very much does exist. And pestivirus is obviously another one as well, that where pestivirus has always been quite common. And again, making sure that bull is double vaccinated and also tested negative. So most reputable studs will also test anything before it leaves the property to make sure it's also not a persistent carrier, because as much as most of those persistent carriers of pestivirus often look stunted and ill-thrifty, sometimes they don't, and they look perfectly normal. So yeah, most reputable studs will test them for pestivirus to make sure they don't have a carrier status, but also vaccinating them as well.
Beautiful. Does anyone have any other questions before I guess we wrap up? If you do, just send us an email. We might be able to contact Chelsea, get an answer to it, put you onto a DVO in your local area who might be able to help you out as well. But thank you so much, Chelsea. It's been absolutely amazing. The wealth of knowledge is, and when you answer questions, it's always an absolute pleasure to listen to, because I just think it's just so practical, and I feel like even though if I don't have livestock, I'm always constantly learning and being like, I'm going to keep that for the future and remind myself to do, I guess, the right thing when I do get a farm. We've got one more. Oh, someone saying thank you. I'm just going to talk a little bit about, I guess, some of the stuff that StockSense will be doing in the future. We've got, I guess, if there's questions that haven't been answered in this session or the previous 4 webinars, or maybe for next week, we do have a Q&A discussion forum. So if I've a few weeks past, you've gone through and consumed a lot of the resources that we've given you, you have a few questions when you're looking at your property yourself, please come to this. So it'll be on Wednesday, April the 10th from 7:30 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. It's also a great opportunity for you to give us feedback. What did we do well, what we didn't, what you'd like to see, that sort of stuff. StockSense will also be at the Seymour Alternative Farming Expo. So we will be there doing some talks at 11:30 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. So that's sort of covering the first 3-4 webinars that we've been doing. Come say hi. We'll have plenty of resources with us as well. We usually have LPA booklets and sort of peri-urban booklets and this, that, and the other, which is great. So thank you so much. Someone just asked in the chat whether these are going to be recorded and if everything's available. So any of the resources Chelsea has mentioned in this webinar series, this recording will go up on our YouTube channel, and that link will be shared with everyone. Any sort of resources that we mention, there's a Dropbox link, so you can access the slides and websites, Excel documents, checklists, anything that we have referenced in the webinar will be available for you. And that email should go out on a Friday afternoon to evening. If you've registered for the webinar, it should go to the same email that you registered with. So if you haven't, and you sort of on Saturday morning go, I haven't gotten anything, please shoot us an email at StockSense. That'd be great, because then we can figure out what's gone wrong and we can get you the appropriate resources. So thank you so much for attending and being here, everyone. Thank you so much for Chelsea for giving your time. Thank you for all the questions. I guess it's always good to see what people are interested in and sort of what are big concerns from people, which is great. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Lisa. I've always loved working with you guys. So no, it's been enjoyable.
Beautiful. Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. Hopefully we'll see you next week. Have a good one.